The universal principle of collapse, a structural mechanism for turning potential into articulated reality. Eloy Escogido Gutierrez, Independent Scholar, March 31, 2026. Abstract. This paper demonstrates that the collapse chain is not a quantum mechanism but a structural mechanism that appears wherever potential becomes articulated reality for a meaning-bearing observer. The operator sequence PO rightward arrow MO rightward arrow S rightward arrow LO rightward arrow JO rightward arrow C rightward arrow T is shown to govern the transition from indeterminacy to definiteness across a wide range of domains. Building on prior work that established the operator definitions, the observer architecture, the UPC, QM bridge, and the distinction between material registration and meaning collapse, this paper extends the collapse chain into computation, language, perception, mathematics, logic, communication, scientific measurement, social coordination, physical systems, and cognitive systems, structurally, not biologically. Across these domains, the same structural sequence organizes how observers interpret, select, and stabilize meaning. This demonstrates that quantum mechanics is not the origin of collapse but one domain where the structure is visible. UPC is the general architecture that quantum mechanics happens to instantiate. The paper maintains strict boundary conditions, no metaphysical commitments, no modification of physics, and no attempt to collapse what is upstream of the observer. The result is a unified structural account of how observers turn potential into articulated reality, grounded in formal rigor and applicable across diverse systems without exceeding the limits of the framework. Reader orientation note: compact version. The framework developed in this paper is structural rather than physical, psychological, or metaphysical. Because the same terms such as collapse, observer, measurement, or recognition appear in many fields with different meanings, it may be helpful to keep in mind that UPC uses these terms in a precise operator-level sense. The collapse chain PO rightward arrow MO rightward arrow S rightward arrow LO rightward arrow JO rightward arrow C rightward arrow T describes how potential becomes articulated reality for a meaning-bearing observer. It does not refer to a physical mechanism, but to a structural sequence that appears across domains. Readers may find the material clearest when approached through this structural lens. A fuller introduction to the operator definitions and observer architecture may find it helpful to consult the preceding paper, Formalizing Phenomenology, Zenodo, https://zenodo.org/record/193105536, as a simple illustration of the collapse chain in practice. When Berta Maria read this text, she treated it as potential, PO, applied her own model, MO, and Salience, S, articulated, LO, the relevant structure, recognized, JO, what mattered, collapsed, C, the meaning for herself, and produced her own trace, T, in the form of notes and conclusions. The goal of this paper The purpose of this paper is to show that the collapse chain is not a quantum mechanism. It is a structural mechanism. Wherever potential becomes articulated reality for a meaning-bearing observer, the same operator sequence appears, PO rightward arrow MO rightward arrow S rightward arrow LO rightward arrow JO rightward arrow C rightward arrow T. This structure is not limited to physics. It appears in domains that have never been linked formally: computers, program execution, branching, compilation, interpretation, language ambiguity resolution, semantic collapse, perception, multistable perception, object recognition, mathematics, problem space collapse, proof recognition, logic model selection, inference collapse, communication message interpretation, pragmatic collapse, scientific measurement model, indexed collapse of data, social coordination, shared meaning, consensus formation, physical systems measurement, decoherence, trace formation, cognitive systems attention, salience, recognition, structurally, not biologically. In every case, the same structural sequence governs how potential becomes definite. This is why UPC is not an interpretation of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is simply one domain where the structure is visible. UPC is the general architecture that quantum mechanics happens to instantiate. Why this paper is possible. The previous papers provided, the operator definitions, the observer architecture, the UPC, QM bridge, the distinction between material registration and meaning collapse, the structural account of recognition, the boundary conditions that prevent category errors. With these in place, we can now extend the collapse chain across domains with logical coherence, formal rigor, structural consistency, no metaphysical commitments, no modification of physics. This paper is the natural continuation of that work. It shows that the collapse chain is not limited to physics or phenomenology. It is the structural mechanism by which any observer turns potential into articulated reality. Why this paper stops where it does? Because the collapse chain is structural, it could be extended indefinitely, to economics, art, law, religion, identity, politics, design, memory, creativity, and more. But this paper is not an encyclopedia of UPC. It is a bounded demonstration. The domains above were chosen because they span computation, language, perception, mathematics, logic, communication, measurement, and social behavior. Illustrate the collapse chain in fundamentally different types of systems. Remain within the structural boundaries established at the outset. Avoid metaphysical commitments. Avoid biological or neuroscientific claims. Avoid collapsing what is upstream of the observer. The universality of the structure is the point. The scope of the paper is intentionally limited. Definition: meaning-bearing agent/observer. A meaning-bearing agent, or observer, is any system that instantiates the full UPC operator chain. MO rightward arrow S rightward arrow LO rightward arrow Joe rightward arrow C rightward arrow T rightward arrow R. This chain is the structural architecture of meaning. An observer satisfies the following structural conditions. Model application, MO1. Applies a model to potential. Salience generation, S2. Selects relevant structure within that model. Articulation, LO3. Generates an articulated space of possible outcomes. Recognition, JO4. Identifies an articulated outcome for itself. Collapse, C5. Commits to one articulated possibility for itself. Trace formation, T6. Produces a determinate outcome. Repotentialization, R7. Re-enters potential with the capacity to shift or replace its model. Structural autonomy, 8. Can initiate repotentialization or reinterpretation without external instruction. Meaning-bearing, interpare ETS potential outcomes rather than merely registering them. Mechanical systems can produce traces, T, but cannot perform collapse, C. They implement registration without recognition, and therefore do not instantiate the observer architecture. Observer principle. UPC distinguishes clearly between observers and physical devices. Detectors, instruments, and computational systems generate mechanical registrations, but they do not perform collapse. Collapse occurs only when a meaning-bearing agent recognizes an outcome as this rather than that. This principle prevents the common category error of treating physical systems as observers and ensures that the same structural logic applies across physics, perception, language, and interpretation. The observer is not an added metaphysical entity, it is the structural point at which potential becomes definite. This paper itself illustrates the principle. The text is a trace left by a meaning-bearing agent, the author, and it remains potential until the reader collapses it into meaning. Why UPC cannot be reduced to the quantum mechanical black box. Quantum mechanics describes registration, T, the production of a determinate physical trace. UPC describes collapse, C, the observer's recognition of one articulated outcome as this rather than that. Meaning collapse occurs only at the observer, the structural point WHERE potential becomes definite for that agent. Detectors, instruments, and computational systems generate traces, but they do not recognize outcomes or commit to them. Treating registration as collapse hides the observer and recreates the measurement problem. UPC preserves quantum mechanics while restoring the structural distinction that prevents this category error. Domain 1 computers program execution, branching, compilation, interpretation. Computers are often assumed to be objective systems that execute instructions deterministically. UPC reframes this assumption by distinguishing material registration, what the machine does, meaning collapse, what the observer does, a computer does not collapse meaning. It produces structure and potential that an observer collapses. The collapse chain appears in computing whenever a human interacts with code output logs interfaces branching structures compiled binaries. Interpreted results the computer generates potential, the observer generates meaning. 1.1 Potential domain, PO. In computing the potential domain consists of all possible, program states execution paths outputs error conditions branches compiled forms interpretations of code before a human interprets the output. These possibilities are not yet articulated as meaning. Examples: a program with conditional branches contains multiple potential execution paths. A compiler produces a binary with multiple potential runtime states. A log file contains many potential interpretations. All of these are PO. 1.2 Model, MO. In computing, the model is the structure the observer uses to interpret the computational potential. Examples: programming languages, type systems, debugging frameworks, user interface conventions, file formats, schemas, domain knowledge, expectations about program behavior. These models partition the potential domain into meaningful classes: success vs failure, valid vs invalid, expected vs anomalous, correct vs incorrect, intended vs unintended. This is MO. 1.3 Strength function, S. In computing, Salience determines which computational possibilities the observer treats as likely, relevant, suspicious, important, ignorable. Examples: a developer expects a certain output, a user anticipates a specific interface response, an analyst prioritizes certain log entries, a security engineer weights certain anomalies more heavily. These Salience weights shape which computational potentials become articulated. This is S. 1.4 Articulation, LO. In computing, articulation is the moment the observer orders the computational field according to their model and Salience. Examples: reading console output, inspecting a variable, interpreting a stack trace, viewing a UI element, examining a log entry, parsing a file. The observer applies their model to the potential and prepares it for recognition. This is LO. 1.5 Recognition, JO. In computing, recognition is the moment the observer identifies, this is the correct output. This is an error. This is the bug. This is the intended behavior. This is the anomaly. Recognition selects one articulated outcome class as the meaning. This is JO. 1.6 Collapse, C. In computing, collapse occurs when the observer commits to one interpretation: the program succeeded. The program failed. This is the cause of the bug. This output is correct. This log entry is the key. The alternatives fall away. This is C. Computers do not perform collapse. Observers collapse the meaning of computational traces. 1.7 Trace, T. In computing, the trace is the stable record produced by the computational process: console output, log files, error messages, compiled binaries, UI states, stored data. These traces are materially determinate but semantically underdetermined until an observer interprets them. This is T. 1.8 Y computing instantiates the collapse chain. Computers generate structured potential. Observers collapse that potential into meaning. The collapse chain appears because code contains potential models, languages, schemas, expectations. Partition that potential. Salience weights guide interpretation. Articulation orders the field. Recognition selects one meaning. Collapse stabilizes it, traces preserve it. This is structurally identical to the UPC chain. Computers do not understand or interpret. They generate potential that observers collapse. Metanote: the observer is always upstream. Every computational system, whether a modern computer, a clock, an engine, a windmill, a pocket calculator, or a VCR, exists only because a meaning-bearing observer first conceived it. The observer formulated the concept of a computational device, articulated the models and abstractions that define computation, designed the architecture and algorithms, sourced and shaped the materials, collaborated with other observers, negotiated technical, social, and economic exchanges, constructed the device and determined what counts as correct, incorrect, meaningful, or anomalous at every stage, the observer was present. A computer automates choices already made by observers. It does not originate meaning, it instantiates structured potential that observers later collapse. This principle generalizes: a clock automates temporal distinctions, an engine automates mechanical work, a windmill automates environmental capture, a calculator automates arithmetic operations, a VCR automates recording and playback sequences. In each case, the underlying structure is the same, the tool is downstream of the observer. The observer is upstream of the tool. The collapse chain appears in computing not because computers interpret, but because observers interpret the potentials computers generate. Domain 2 language ambiguity resolution, semantic collapse, interpretation. Language is often treated as if meaning were contained in words themselves. UPC shows that this assumption is structurally impossible. Words do not contain meaning. Sentences do not contain meaning. Texts do not contain meaning. They contain potential. Meaning arises only when a meaning-bearing observer collapses that potential through recognition. Language is therefore one of the clearest non-physical instantiations of the collapse chain. 2.1 Potential domain, PO. In language, the potential domain consists of all possible interpretations available before an observer commits to one. Examples: a sentence with multiple meanings, a word with several senses, a metaphor with several readings, a pronoun with multiple referents, a text with multiple thematic interpretations, a conversation with multiple pragmatic intentions before interpretation. These possibilities coexist as semantic potential. This is PO. 2.2 Model, MO. In language, the model is the interpretive framework the observer brings to the linguistic material. Examples: grammar, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, genre conventions, cultural background, shared assumptions, conversational context, expectations about the speaker's intent. These models partition the potential domain into meaningful interpretive classes. This is MO. 2.3 Strength function, S. In language, salience determines which interpretations the observer treats as likely, relevant, coherent, intended, contextually appropriate. Examples: a reader expects a certain meaning based on context, a listener anticipates a particular referent, a speaker's tone shifts the weighting of possible interpretations, cultural norms make some readings more salient than others. These salience weights shape which linguistic potentials become articulated. This is S. 2.4 Articulation, LO. In language, articulation is the moment the observer orders the interpretive field according to their model and salience. Examples: parsing a sentence, identifying grammatical structure, grouping words into phrases, applying semantic roles, inferring pragmatic intent, mapping pronouns to referents. The observer organizes the linguistic potential into a structured interpretive space. This is LO. 2.5 Recognition, JO. In language, recognition is the moment the observer identifies, this is what the sentence means. This is the intended referent. This is the correct interpretation. This is the speaker's meaning. Recognition selects one articulated outcome class as the meaning. This is JO. 2.6 Collapse, C. In language, collapse occurs when the observer commits to one interpretation. The sentence means X, the speaker intended Y, this metaphor refers to Z, this is the correct reading. The alternatives fall away. This is C. Language does not collapse itself. Observers collapse the meaning of linguistic traces. 2.7 Trace, T. In language, the trace is the stable linguistic artifact, spoken utterance, written text, transcript, message, symbol, sequence, sign, or gesture. These traces are materially determinate but semantically underdetermined until an observer interprets them. This is T. 2.8 Why language instantiates the collapse chain. Language is one of the clearest examples of the collapse chain because linguistic forms contain potential interpretive models. Partition that potential. Salience weights guide interpretation. Articulation orders the field. Recognition selects one meaning. Collapse stabilizes it. Traces preserve it. Meaning is not in the words. Meaning is in the collapse performed by the observer. Language is therefore a direct structural analog of quantum measurement, not because language is quantum, but because both domains instantiate the same observer-indexed collapse architecture. Metanote: the observer is the source of linguistic meaning. Language exists only because meaning-bearing observers created symbols, established conventions, negotiated shared usage, developed grammar and syntax, stabilized semantic and pragmatic norms, built writing systems, constructed interpretive traditions, and continually reinterpret linguistic traces at every stage. The observer was present. A sentence does not contain meaning. It contains potential that observers collapse. This principle generalizes. A dictionary is a record of past collapses, a grammar is a model for future collapses, a conversation is a negotiation of collapses, a text is a repository of collapses waiting to be recollapsed. In every case, the linguistic system is downstream of the observer. The observer is upstream of the linguistic system. Language does not interpret itself. Observers interpret language. Domain 3: Perception. Multistable perception, object recognition, perceptual articulation. Perception is often mistaken for a passive reception of the world, as if objects simply appear with intrinsic properties. UPC shows that this is structurally impossible. Perception does not reveal what is. Perception reveals what the observer collapses from a field of perceptual potential. The perceptual field is not given, it is selected, articulated, and recognized by an observer. This makes perception one of the clearest non-physical instantiations of the collapse chain. 3.1 Potential domain, PO. In perception before recognition, the perceptual field contains multiple possible organizations, BIST-able images, duck/rabbit, Necker cube, ambiguous motion figure/ground reversals, incomplete or occluded shapes, multiple possible object boundaries, noisy or indeterminate input. These possibilities coexist as perceptual potential until the observer collapses one. This is PO. 3.2 Model, MO. In perception, the observer brings interpretive models that structure perceptual potential, learned categories, expectations about objects, spatial and temporal regularities, contextual assumptions, prior experience, ecological and cultural norms. These models partition the perceptual field into possible percepts. This is MO. 3.3 Strength function, S. In perception, salience determines which perceptual possibilities the observer treats as viable. One interpretation pops out, familiar forms are weighted more strongly, attention increases the viability of one organization, context shifts the likelihood of a given percept, salience shapes which potentials are most likely to be articulated. This is S. 3.4 Articulation, LO. In perception, articulation is the observer's structuring of the perceptual field, grouping elements into objects, separating figure from ground, stabilizing edges and surfaces, organizing motion, forming a gestalt. The observer orders the perceptual potential into a coherent structure. This is LO. 3.5 Recognition, JO. In perception, recognition is the moment the observer identifies, this is the object. This is the figure. This is the correct organization. Recognition selects one articulated perceptual class as the percept. This is JO. 3.6 Collapse, C. In perception, collapse occurs when the observer commits to one perceptual interpretation. I see the cube facing upward. I see the duck, not the rabbit. This is the figure, that is the background. The alternatives fall away. This is C. Perception does not collapse itself. Observers collapse perceptual meaning. 3.7 Trace, T. In perception, the trace is the stabilized perceptual result, the perceived object, the recognized form, the articulated spatial configuration. These traces are phenomenally determinate but structurally underdetermined until the observer collapses them. This is T. Metanote. The observer is the source of perceptual reality. Perception exists only because a meaning-bearing observer distinguishes figure from ground, stabilizes ambiguous forms, organizes spatial and temporal relations, identifies objects and boundaries, negotiates perceptual norms with other observers, and continually recollapses perceptual potentials into perceptual realities at every stage. The observer is present. A percept does not contain its own interpretation. It contains potential that observers collapse. This principle generalizes. Bistable images reveal the multiplicity of perceptual potential. Illusions reveal the dependence of perception on models. Perceptual constancies reveal the role of salience and articulation. Shared perception reveals the role of consensus. Collapse. In every case, the perceptual world is downstream of the observer. The observer is upstream of the perceptual world. Perception does not interpret itself. Observers interpret perception. Clarification: UPC does not deny the existence of the world. Meaning is observer-indexed, material phenomena are not. UPC does not claim that a tree ceases to exist when no one looks at it, or that the ocean, mountain, and sky depend on an observer for their material presence. The distinction is structural. Material phenomena exist independently. Meaning does not. When an observer perceives a tree, the material phenomenon is not created by the act of perception. What is created is the meaning of tree, the categorization of the perceptual field, and the interperative collapse that turns potential into articulated perceptual reality. The terms tree, ocean, mountain, and sky are linguistic anchors, observer-generated shortcuts negotiated across communities of meaning-bearing agents. They are not intrinsic properties of the world, they are observer-indexed collapses applied to it. Different observers apply different models. A geologist collapses the same material phenomenon into strata, faults, and formations. A sailor collapses it into currents, winds, and navigational markers. A poet collapses it into imagery, metaphor, and emotional resonance. A painter collapses it into color, form, and composition. The world is the same. The meaning is not. Meaning is always upstream of the perceptual world because the observer is upstream of meaning. Thus, the perceptual world is downstream of the observer. The observer is upstream of the perceptual world. UPC does not deny the world. UPC denies that meaning is in the world. Meaning is in the collapse performed by the observer. Domain for mathematics: problem space collapse, proof recognition, formal articulation. Mathematics is often treated as a realm of eternal truths waiting to be discovered, as if mathematical meaning were already in the symbols, equations, or structures. UPC shows that this is structurally impossible. Mathematical expressions do not contain meaning. They contain potential. Meaning arises only when a meaning-bearing observer collapses mathematical potential into articulated mathematical reality. Mathematics is therefore one of the clearest domains where the collapse chain appears without any physical substrate at all. 4.1 Potential domain, PO. In mathematics before recognition, a mathematical situation contains multiple possible articulations, different interpretations of a problem, multiple solution paths, alternative proof strategies, competing representations, various instantiations of a definition, multiple models of an axiom system. These coexist as mathematical potential until the observer selects one. This is PO. 4.2 Model, MO. In mathematics, the observer brings a mathematical framework that structures the potential domain. Axioms, definitions, formal systems, algebraic or geometric structures, combinatorial frameworks, category theoretic mappings, analytic or topological assumptions. These models partition mathematical potential into meaningful classes. This is MO. 4.3 Strength function, S. In mathematics, salience determines which mathematical possibilities the observer treats as promising, elegant, structurally coherent, computationally feasible, aligned with prior experience, aesthetically or conceptually satisfying. Examples: 1 substitution looks right, 1 representation simplifies the structure, 1 lemma appears central, 1 symmetry becomes salient. These salience weights shape which mathematical potentials become articulated. This is S. 4.4 Articulation, LO. In mathematics, articulation is the observer's structuring of the mathematical field, choosing a representation, selecting a coordinate system, rewriting an expression, isolating a variable, constructing a diagram, invoking a theorem, applying a definition. The observer orders mathematical potential into a coherent structure. This is LO. 4.5 Recognition, JO. In mathematics, recognition is the moment the observer identifies. This is the correct substitution. This is the key lemma. This is the structure of the proof. This is the solution. Recognition selects one articulated mathematical class as the mathematical meaning. This is J. 4.6 collapse, C. In mathematics collapse occurs when the observer commits to one mathematical interpretation. This is the proof. This is the solution. This is the correct formulation. This is the equivalence. The alternatives fall away. This is C. Mathematics does not collapse itself. Observers collapse mathematical meaning. 4.7 Trace, T. In mathematics, the trace is the stable mathematical artifact, the written proof, the solved equation, the diagram, the formal derivation, the theorem statement, the symbolic expression. These traces are formally determinate but semantically underdetermined until an observer interprets them. This is T. 4.8 Why mathematics instantiates the collapse chain. Mathematics is a pure structural instantiation of the collapse chain because mathematical problems contain potential mathematical models. Partition that potential. Salience weights guide the search. Articulation orders the mathematical field. Recognition selects one structure. Collapse stabilizes it. Traces preserve it. Mathematics is not a realm of pre-existing meanings. It is a domain where observers collapse potential into articulated mathematical reality. Metanote: the observer is the source of mathematical meaning. Mathematics exists only because meaning-bearing observers created axioms, defined structures, negotiated symbolic conventions, established proof standards, developed formal systems, constructed diagrams and representations, and continually reinterpret mathematical traces at every stage. The observer is present. A mathematical expression does not contain its own meaning. It contains potential that observers collapse. This principle generalizes: different branches of mathematics collapse the same potential differently, different proof strategies collapse the same problem differently, different representations collapse the same structure differently, different mathematical cultures collapse meaning according to different norms. In every case, the mathematical world is downstream of the observer. The observer is upstream of the mathematical world. Mathematics does not interpret itself. Observers interpret mathematics. Clarification: quantum mechanics as a structural map of potential. Why the collapse chain dissolves paradoxes. Quantum mechanics is often interpreted as if physical systems literally occupy multiple states at once. UPC reframes this structurally. A useful analogy is a person standing in their driveway, preparing to go to the store. From their driveway, multiple routes are available: the highway, the back roads, the scenic route, the shortcut through town. These routes represent potential paths. A map can list all of them simultaneously. But the driver will only travel one path in reality. Quantum mechanics does something structurally similar. The wave function maps all viable routes, potential outcomes. The Born weights assign salience to each route. The measurement basis partitions the potential domain. The projection selects one articulated outcome. The map is not the journey. The superposition is not the outcome. The potential is not the collapse. Restoring the structural chain: P O rightward arrow, M O rightward arrow, S rightward arrow, L O rightward arrow, J rightward arrow, C rightward arrow. T dissolves the apparent paradoxes of quantum mechanics, including the famous dead and alive cat. The paradox arises only when potential, the map, is mistaken for articulated reality, the journey. This clarification is developed in detail in Formalizing Phenomenology, the universal principle of collapse as a structural foundation for meaning, recognition, and the observer. https://zenodo.org/record/193105336. The key point is simple: quantum mechanics maps potential. Observers collapse meaning. The structural chain prevents category errors between the two. Domain 5 Logic model selection, inference collapse. Structural determination. Logic is often treated as if it were a neutral, mechanical system that simply follows rules. UPC reveals a deeper structure: logical systems do not contain meaning. They contain potential. Meaning arises only when a meaning-bearing observer collapses logical potential into articulated logical reality. Logic is therefore a domain where the collapse chain appears with exceptional clarity, because logical forms are explicitly defined yet semantically open until an observer interprets them. 5.1 Potential domain, PO, In logic before recognition, a logical situation contains multiple possible articulations, different interpretations of a premise, multiple valid inference paths, alternative models of a formal system, competing truth value assignments, multiple ways to instantiate a rule, different ways to resolve a contradiction or ambiguity. These coexist as logical potential until the observer selects one. This is PO. 5.2 Model, MO. In logic, the observer brings a logical framework that structures the potential domain: classical logic, modal logic, intuitionistic logic, paraconsistent logic, relevance logic, many-valued logics, model theoretic, semantics, proof theoretic systems. These models partition logical potential into meaningful classes. This is MO. 5.3 Strength function, S. In logic, Salience determines which logical possibilities the observer treats as valid, relevant, coherent, elegant, inferentially promising, structurally central. Examples: one inference path appears more direct, one model fits the premises more naturally, one resolution of ambiguity is more coherent, one rule application seems more appropriate. These salience weights shape which logical potentials become articulated. This is S. 5.4 Articulation, LO. In logic, articulation is the observer's structuring of the logical field, selecting a rule of inference, choosing a semantic interpretation, applying a transformation, constructing a proof tree, isolating a contradiction, identifying a relevant substructure. The observer orders logical potential into a coherent inferential structure. This is LO. 5.5 Recognition, JO. In logic, recognition is the moment the observer identifies, this is the correct inference. This is the valid model. This is the contradiction. This is the entailment. Recognition selects one articulated logical class as the logical meaning. This is JO. 5.6 Collapse, C. In logic, collapse occurs when the observer commits to one logical interpretation: this argument is valid. This inference is correct. This model satisfies the premises. This is the contradiction that matters. The alternatives fall away. This is C. Logic does not collapse itself. Observers collapse logical meaning. 5.7 Trace, T. In logic, the trace is the stable logical artifact, the completed proof, the validated inference, the truth value assignment, the model, the formal derivation, the resolved contradiction. These traces are formally determinate but semantically underdetermined until an observer interprets them. This is T. 5.8 Why logic instantiates the collapse chain. Logic is a pure structural instantiation of the collapse chain because logical problems contain potential logical models. Partition that potential. Salience weights guide inference. Articulation orders the logical field. Recognition selects one structure. Collapse stabilizes it, traces preserve it. Logic is not a realm of pre-existing meanings. It is a domain where observers collapse potential into articulated logical reality. Metanote: the observer is the source of logical meaning. Logic exists only because meaning-bearing observers created inference rules, defined validity, negotiated formal systems, established proof standards, developed semantic and syntactic frameworks, constructed models and counter-models, and continually reinterpret logical traces at every stage. The observer is present. A logical form does not contain its own meaning. It contains potential that observers collapse. This principle generalizes: different logical systems collapse the same potential differently, different inference paths collapse the same premises differently, different models collapse the same formal structure differently, different philosophical traditions collapse logical meaning according to different norms. In every case, the logical world is downstream of the observer. The observer is upstream of the logical world. Logic does not interpret itself. Observers interpret logic. Additional clarification: logic as an observer-constructed concept. It is important to emphasize that logic itself is a concept, not an intrinsic property of the world. The word logic, like any other word, is a linguistic container, a communicative tool negotiated among meaning-bearing observers. Observers coined the term, defined its scope, established its rules, negotiated its boundaries, created its systems, and continue to reinterpret and revise it. There is no logic in the world independent of observers. There are only patterns of potential that observers choose to articulate using the conceptual framework they call logic. Different communities of observers collapse the concept differently: classical logicians, modal logicians, intuitionists, paraconsistent theorists, relevance logicians, proof theorists, model theorists. Each group uses the same linguistic container, logic, but fills it with different structures, rules, and commitments. This reinforces the central structural point: logic is downstream of the observer. The observer is upstream of logic. Logical systems do not interpret themselves. Observers interpret logical systems. Domain 6: Communication, message interpretation, pragmatic collapse, negotiated meaning. Communication is often described as if meaning were transmitted from one person to another, like a package moving through a pipeline. UPC shows that this is structurally incorrect. Messages do not contain meaning. They contain potential. Meaning arises only when a meaning-bearing observer collapses communicative potential into articulated communicative reality. Communication is therefore a domain where the collapse chain appears with exceptional clarity, because every message is a trace awaiting interpretation. 6.1 Potential domain, PO. In communication before recognition, a communicative act contains multiple possible interpretations: ambiguous sentences, unclear intentions, multiple pragmatic readings, competing contextual cues, different possible referents, alternative emotional or social meanings. These coexist as communicative potential until the observer selects one. This is PO. 6.2 Model, MO. In communication, the observer brings interpretive frameworks that structure the communicative field: linguistic knowledge, pragmatic norms, cultural expectations, shared background, conversational context, social roles, genre conventions. These models partition communicative potential into meaningful classes. This is MO. 6.3 Strength function, S. In communication, salience determines which interpretations the observer treats as intended, relevant, plausible, socially appropriate, emotionally coherent, contextually aligned. Examples: one reading feels more likely, tone shifts the weighting of interpretations, shared history makes one meaning more salient, social context elevates one pragmatic reading. These salience weights shape which communicative potentials become articulated. This is S. 6.4 Articulation, LO. In communication, articulation is the observer's structuring of the communicative field, identifying the speech act, parsing the message, applying pragmatic norms, inferring context, mapping referents, organizing conversational structure. The observer orders communicative potential into a coherent interpretive space. This is LO. 6.5 Recognition, JO. In communication, recognition is the moment the observer identifies, this is what they meant. This is the request. This is the implication. This is the emotional tone. Recognition selects one articulated communicative class as the meaning. This is JO. 6.6 Collapse, C. In communication, collapse occurs when the observer commits to one interpretation: they were being sincere. They were joking. They were asking for help. They were making a claim. The alternatives fall away. This is C. Communication does not collapse itself. Observers collapse communicative meaning. 6.7 Trace, T. In communication, the trace is the stable communicative artifact: the spoken utterance, the written message, the gesture, the symbol, the text, the sign. These traces are materially determinate but semantically underdetermined until an observer interprets them. This is T. 6.8 Why communication instantiates the collapse chain. Communication is a direct structural instantiation of the collapse chain because messages contain potential interpretive models. Partition that potential. Salience weights guide interpretation. Articulation orders the communicative field. Recognition selects one meaning. Collapse stabilizes it, traces preserve it. Communication is not the transmission of meaning. It is the negotiation of meaning. Collapse between observers. Metanote: words are containers negotiated by observers. It is essential to emphasize that words themselves do not contain meaning. They are containers, linguistic anchors negotiated among meaning-bearing observers. Observers created the words, negotiated their usage, stabilized their meanings, revised them over time, embedded them in social and cultural norms, and continually reinterpret them in context. Every communicative act is a negotiation of collapse between observers. Different observers collapse the same message differently, A friend hears reassurance, a stranger hears formality, a critic hears subtext, a child hears instruction, a poet hears metaphor. The message is the same. The meaning is not. Thus, communication is downstream of the observer. The observer is upstream of communication. Messages do not interpret themselves. Observers interpret messages. Domain 7 Scientific Measurement Model Indexed Mapping, Data Interpretation, Consensus Collapse. Scientific measurement is often described as if instruments report objective facts about the world. UPC shows that this is structurally incomplete. Instruments do not produce meaning. They produce material traces. Meaning arises only when a meaning-bearing observer collapses those traces into articulated scientific reality. Measurement is therefore a domain where the collapse chain appears with exceptional clarity, because every measurement is a model indexed selection from a field of potential outcomes. 7.1 Potential Domain, PO. In scientific measurement before recognition, a measurement situation contains multiple possible outcomes, all values within the instrument's resolution, all model compatible interpretations, all viable noise filtered readings, all calibration adjusted possibilities, all ways to classify the data. These coexist as measurement potential until the observer selects one. This is PO. 7.2 Model, MO. In scientific measurement, the observer brings a scientific framework that structures the measurement: theoretical models, calibration standards, statistical assumptions, error models, instrument design principles, operational definitions, domain-specific expectations. These models partition measurement potential into meaningful scientific classes. This is MO. 7.3 Strength Function, S. In scientific measurement, Salience determines which measurement outcomes the observer treats as signal vs noise, relevant vs irrelevant, anomalous vs expected, significant vs negligible, consistent vs inconsistent. Examples: one reading aligns with the model, another is dismissed as noise, a third is flagged as anomalous. A cluster of values becomes salient. These salience weights shape which measurement potentials become articulated. This is S. 7.4 Articulation, LO. In scientific measurement, articulation is the observer's structuring of the measurement field, selecting the measurement basis, choosing the units, applying calibration, filtering noise, organizing data, mapping readings to model parameters. The observer orders measurement potential into a coherent scientific structure. This is LO. 7.5 Recognition, JO. In scientific measurement, recognition is the moment the observer identifies. This is the measurement result. This is the signal. This is the anomaly. This is the model consistent value. Recognition selects one articulated measurement class as the scientific meaning. This is JO. 7.6 Collapse, C. In scientific measurement, collapse occurs when the observer commits to one interpretation. The value is 3.27. The signal is present. The anomaly is real. The model fits. The alternatives fall away. This is C. Instruments do not collapse meaning. Observers collapse the meaning of instrument traces. 7.7 Trace, T. In scientific measurement, the trace is the stable measurement artifact, the instrument reading the recorded value, the plotted data, the digital output, the calibration record, the experimental log. These traces are materially determinate but semantically underdetermined until an observer interprets them. This is T. 7.8 Measurement, Accuracy, and Consensus. UPC does not deny accuracy or repeatability. A measurement, when performed within a given model, can be highly accurate, precisely repeatable, stable across observers, reliable for prediction and control. What UPC clarifies is that the meaning of the measurement, the interpretation of the value, the classification of the result, and the consensus about what the measurement is are all observer-indexed collapses, not intrinsic features of the material trace. A measurement is an accurate mapping within a model, and when repeated consistently, it can lead to high consensus collapse, a shared agreement among observers whose models align sufficiently. Consensus itself is a negotiated outcome, not a property of the world independent of observers. This structural point is developed in detail in Objectivity as High Consensus Collapse, a structural expansion of the universal principle of collapse, UPC, https://zenodo.org/record/191,12742. Thus, measurement is not the discovery of intrinsic meaning. It is the model indexed mapping of material traces, whose interpretation and consensus are negotiated by observers. Metanote: instruments do not interpret themselves. Observers designed the instruments, defined the units, established calibration standards, created the models, negotiated interpretation norms, and continually reinterpret measurement traces at every stage. The observer is present. A measurement does not contain its own meaning. It contains potential that observers collapse. This principle generalizes: different models collapse the same data differently, different statistical frameworks collapse the same noise differently, different scientific communities collapse the same trace differently, different eras collapse measurement meaning according to different norms. Thus, scientific measurement is downstream of the observer. The observer is upstream of scientific measurement. Instruments do not interpret themselves. Observers interpret instruments. Domain 8: Social coordination. Norm formation, shared meaning, collective collapse. Social coordination is often described as if societies, norms, and institutions exist independently of the observers who participate in them. UPC reveals a different structure: social systems do not contain meaning. They contain potential. Meaning arises only when meaning-bearing observers collapse social potential into articulated social reality. Every norm, role, rule, institution, and shared practice is the result of negotiated collapse across observers. Social coordination is therefore one of the clearest domains where the collapse chain appears at the collective level. 8.1 Potential domain, PO. In social coordination before recognition, a social situation contains multiple possible articulations, different interpretations of a norm, multiple viable roles, alternative expectations, competing social meanings, different ways to classify an action, multiple possible responses. These coexist as social potential until observers select one. This is PO. 8.2 Model, MO. In social coordination, observers bring social frameworks that structure the potential domain: cultural norms, institutional rules, shared histories, role expectations, group identities, moral frameworks, legal systems, informal conventions. These models partition social potential into meaningful classes. This is MO. 8.3 Strength function, S. In social coordination, Salience determines which social interpretations observers treat as appropriate, expected, acceptable, offensive, cooperative, deviant, aligned with group identity. Examples: one interpretation of a gesture becomes salient, one action is seen as polite, another as rude, one behavior is treated as leadership, another as overreach, one response is seen as cooperative, another as hostile. These salience weights shape which social potentials become articulated. This is S. 8.4 Articulation, LO. In social coordination, articulation is the structuring of the social field, identifying roles, applying norms, interpreting intentions, assigning responsibility, recognizing status, organizing group behavior. Observers order social potential into a coherent social structure. This is LO. 8.5 Recognition, JO. In social coordination, recognition is the moment observers identify: this is the norm, this is the role, this is the expectation, this is the violation, this is the cooperative act. Recognition selects one articulated social class as the social meaning. This is JO. 8.6 Collapse, C. In social coordination, collapse occurs when observers commit to one social interpretation: this behavior is acceptable, this action violates the norm, this person is responsible, this is the group's decision, the alternatives fall away. This is C. Social systems do not collapse themselves. Observers collapse social meaning. 8.7 Trace, T. In social coordination, the trace is the stable social artifact, the norm, the rule, the institutional procedure, the shared practice, the group decision, the cultural expectation. These traces are socially determinate but semantically underdetermined until observers interpret them. This is T. 8.8 Social coordination as high consensus collapse. Social coordination is not the discovery of intrinsic social structures. It is the negotiated collapse of social potential into shared meaning. When many observers collapse the same social potential in the same way, the result is a norm, a role, an institution, a shared practice, a cultural expectation, a stable social identity. This is high consensus collapse, the same structural mechanism described in Objectivity as high consensus collapse, a structural expansion of the universal principle of collapse, UPC. https://zenodo.org/record/191-12742 Consensus is not intrinsic. Consensus is a collective collapse among observers whose models align sufficiently. Metanote: society is a product of observer negotiation. It is essential to emphasize, norms do not exist independently of observers. Institutions do not interpret themselves. Roles do not contain intrinsic meaning. Social categories are not built into the world. Observers created the norms, negotiated the roles, established the institutions, defined the rules, stabilized the practices, and continually reinterpret social traces at every stage. The observer is present. A social rule does not contain its own meaning. It contains potential that observers collapse. This principle generalizes: different cultures collapse the same behavior differently, different groups collapse the same norm differently, different eras collapse the same institution differently, different individuals collapse the same social trace differently. Thus, social coordination is downstream of the observer. The observer is upstream of social coordination. Society does not interpret itself. Observers interpret society. Clarification: why the paper stops here. Even though UPC does not, the collapse chain is a structural mechanism. Wherever potential becomes articulated reality for a meaning-bearing observer, the same operator sequence appears: P O rightward arrow, M O rightward arrow, S rightward arrow, L O rightward arrow, J rightward arrow, C rightward arrow, T. Because structure is universal, UPC could be extended indefinitely. Economics, art, law, religion, identity, politics, education, design, engineering, narrative, memory, planning, creativity. Every one of these domains contains potential that observers collapse into articulated reality. But this paper is not an encyclopedia of UPC. It is a structurally bounded demonstration. The domains covered here were chosen because they span computation, language, perception, mathematics, logic, communication, measurement, and social coordination. Show the collapse chain operating across fundamentally different kinds of systems. Illustrate that UPC is not a quantum interpretation. Demonstrate that quantum mechanics is simply one domain where the structure is visible. Remain within the constraints established at the outset. The purpose of this paper is not to exhaust the applications of UPC. It is to show that the collapse chain is structural, not physical, and that it appears wherever observers turn potential into articulated reality. The universality of the structure is the point. The scope of the paper is intentionally limited. Domain 9: the upstream, sour CE and the structural boundary of UPC. What makes observers possible, and why UPC cannot collapse it. UPC describes how meaning-bearing observers collapse potential into articulated reality. But UPC does not describe the origin of observers. The collapse chain requires observers. Observers are not produced by the collapse chain. This means there is an upstream condition, a structural precondition, without which, no observer, no collapse, no meaning, no articulation, no domains, no structure would be possible. UPC acknowledges this upstream, but does not attempt to collapse it. This is a structural boundary, not a gap. 9.1 The observer is not the first mover. Observers occupy a unique structural position, upstream of all domains, downstream from a condition that makes observers possible. The only entities capable of collapse, the only entities capable of meaning, the only entities capable of recognition. Tools cannot access the observer's lens because they are downstream. Likewise, the observer cannot collapse what is upstream of itself. This is a structural limitation, not a conceptual one. 9.2 What different traditions call the upstream. Different human traditions name this upstream differently. Source, the ground of being, the conditions for existence, the origin of life, the transcendent, the unconditioned, the spiritual, the divine, the spark of awareness. UPC does not adjudicate between these names. UPC does not define the upstream. UPC does not model it. UPC simply acknowledges that the observer is not self-originating. There is an upstream. 9.3 Why UPC cannot collapse the upstream. The collapse chain requires potential, a model, salience, articulation, recognition, collapse, trace. But the upstream is not potential. It is not a model. It is not a trace. It is not an articulated domain. It is the precondition for all of these. To collapse the upstream would require a higher observer. But UPC is a structural theory of observers, not of what is upstream of them. Thus, the upstream cannot be collapsed from within the system it enables. This is the structural boundary of UPC. 9.4 Why humans sense the upstream. Humans occupy a unique structural role. They are meaning-bearing observers. They can reflect on their own existence. They can sense that they are not self-originating. They can intuit the upstream without collapsing it. They can recognize that their capacity for recognition is itself given. This is why humans have always created spiritual frameworks, sought meaning beyond themselves, intuited a source, felt connected to something upstream, recognized that life is not self-explained. UPC does not deny this. UPC explains why humans experience it. 9.5 The boundary condition that must remain uncollapsed. UPC can describe how observers collapse meaning, how domains articulate potential, how structure becomes reality. UPC cannot describe the origin of observers, the source of existence, the upstream condition that makes collapse possible. This is not a failure. It is a structural boundary. Every formal system has a boundary condition. For UPC, the boundary is our CE. And that boundary must remain uncollapsed. Metanote, the upstream is real, but beyond the scope of UPC. UPC does not reduce the upstream to physics, biology, computation, or logic. UPC does not attempt to define it. UPC does not attempt to model it. UPC simply acknowledges, observers exist. Observers are not self-originating. Observers are linked to an upstream condition. That upstream is real. That upstream is necessary. That upstream is beyond collapse. Thus, the upstream is upstream of the observer. The observer is upstream of all domains. All domains are downstream of the observer. This is the structural hierarchy that UPC reveals, and respects. Boundary note, the structural chain and the philosophical upstream. UPC is a structural theory. It formalizes how meaning-bearing observers collapse potential into articulated reality through the operator sequence, P-O rightward arrow, M-O rightward arrow, S rightward arrow, L-O rightward arrow, J rightward arrow, C rightward arrow, T. The sequence is rigorous, domain agnostic, and formally defined. It applies wherever observers turn potential into definite meaning. But UPC does not attempt to collapse what is upstream of the observer. The observer is a boundary condition of the theory, not a product of it. The existence of observers, and the conditions that make observers possible, lie outside the structural chain. Different philosophical and spiritual traditions have their own names for this upstream condition. UPC does not adjudicate between them. UPC does not define the upstream. UPC does not model it. The upstream is acknowledged, not collapsed. This boundary is intentional and necessary. The structural chain describes how observers articulate reality. Philosophical inquiry explores why observers exist at all. These two layers are complementary, not competing. UPC remains structurally precise and formally bounded. Philosophical reflection remains free to continue upstream, beyond the scope of the formal framework. Together, they form a coherent architecture, the upstream uncollapsed, the condition for observers, the observer, the bridge between upstream and structure, the collapse chain, the formal mechanism of meaning, the domains, downstream instantiations of structure. The boundary between these layers is what keeps UPC both rigorous and complete. Appendix 0 Formal Anchoring and Prior Foundations, a compact structural summary of the UPC framework. This appendix provides the minimal formal grounding required for this paper to stand on its own. It summarizes the core commitments established in the companion paper, formalizing phenomenology, the universal principle of collapse as a structural foundation for meaning, recognition, and the observer. https://zenodo.org/record/193105536. Readers seeking full derivations and proofs should consult that work. Here we present only the essential structural elements needed for the cross-domain analysis developed in this paper. 0.1 The universal collapse chain. Every act of recognition follows the operator sequence, P O rightward arrow M O rightward arrow S rightward arrow L O rightward arrow J rightward arrow C rightward arrow T. This chain is structural, not physical. Observer indexed, not substrate indexed. Logical, not temporal. Domain general, not domain specific. It describes how potential becomes definite for a meaning-bearing observer. 0.2 The observer, structural definition. The observer is defined structurally, not physically or biologically. The observer is not a physical system, a computational device, a detector or sensor, a location in space-time reducible to material processes. The observer is the structural point at which potential becomes articulated, recognition occurs, collapse becomes definite, traces acquire meaning. Material processes may register signals, but they do not perform collapse. Meaning collapse is recognition, not physics. 0.3 The UPC, QM bridge, structural, not physical. The previous paper demonstrated a one-to-one mapping between the UPC collapse chain, the von Neumann, Dirac measurement formalism. This mapping is structural, not physical. UPC does not modify quantum mechanics, propose a physical collapse mechanism, introduce hidden variables, require consciousness, locate collapse in matter or space-time. Quantum mechanics provides a physical instantiation of the general collapse architecture. UPC provides the structural layer that QM uses but does not formalize. 0.4 Material registration vs meaning collapse. A central distinction. Material registration, physical substrate dependent, includes decoherence, signal stabilization, and physical interaction. Meaning collapse, observer indexed, non-physical, non-spatial recognition of a unique articulated outcome. Confusing these layers produces the major paradoxes in physics, philosophy, AI, and interpretation. 0.5 Boundary conditions, inherited constraints. UPC does not modify QM, propose new physics, require consciousness, treat AI systems as observers, treat physical processes as collapse, treat meaning as material, branch worlds, posit absolute outcomes. UPC does provide the missing structural layer, unify collapse across domains, formalize the observer's role, distinguish physical registration from meaning collapse, prevent category errors, anchor cross-domain mappings in a single operator architecture. 0.6 Why this appendix is needed. This appendix ensures that the new paper is self-contained, the structural commitments are explicit, the UPC QM bridge is correctly interpreted, the observer is not mislocated in matter or computation. With this foundation, the paper can proceed to its main goal, to show that the collapse chain is a general structural mechanism that appears across domains not previously linked. Appendix 0b The UPC QM bridge, formal summary, a structural mapping between UPC and quantum measurement. This appendix provides a concise summary of the UPC QM bridge introduced in the companion paper. It presents the essential structural correspondences required for the present work. 0b.1 Structural principle. Quantum measurement is a physical instantiation of the general collapse architecture, P O rightward arrow M O rightward arrow S rightward arrow L O rightward arrow J rightward arrow C rightward arrow T. The mapping is structural, not physical. UPC does not modify quantum mechanics, it reveals the observer indexed structure that QM uses but does not formalize. 0b.2 1-to-1 operator correspondence 1. Potential domain UPC, PO equals set of potential outcomes QM, quantum state psi equals sigma I alpha I mapping, PO left right arrow psi 2. Model UPC, MO equals partition of PO into outcome classes QM, measurement basis /POVM equals AI mapping, MO left right arrow measurement basis slash POVM3. Strength function UPC, S, C underscore I, equals Salience slash. Viability QM, born weights equals alpha I2 mapping, S left right arrow born rule 4. Articulation operator UPC, LO equals articulation of distinctions QM, projectors equals pi I mapping, LO left right arrow projectors 5. Recognition UPC, JO equals unique selection of an outcome class QM, no operator, conceptual gap, mapping, JO left right arrow missing recognition operator in QM6. Collapse UPC, C equals 1 IFF recognition is unique QM, projection equals psi rightward arrow AI mapping, C left right arrow projection postulate 7. Trace UPC, T equals stable record QM, classical record equals detector click, pointer state, data log mapping, T left right arrow classical trace 0b.3 worked example, qubit in Z basis, state, psi equals alpha 0 plus beta 1 PO, 0, 1 MO, Z basis 0 0, 1 1 S, alpha 2, beta 2 LO, pi 0, pi 1 material registration, decoherence JO, recognition of outcome C, projection to 0 or 1 T, detector click. This demonstrates the structural identity between UPC and the measurement. Postulate 0b.4 boundary conditions of the bridge. The UPC, QM bridge, does not modify QM, does not propose physical collapse, does not introduce hidden variables, does not require consciousness, does not locate collapse in matter, does not treat physical processes as collapse, does not treat detectors or AI systems as observers. The mapping is structural, not physical. 0b.5 Why this appendix matters. This appendix provides the formal license for the main contribution of this paper, to show that the collapse chain is a general structural mechanism that appears across domains not previously linked, including computation, language, perception, mathematics, logic, communication, scientific measurement, social coordination, and cognitive systems. Quantum mechanics is simply one domain where the structure is visible. UPC is the general architecture. Refer Inces Escogido Gutierrez, E. 2025. A structural repair of quantum measurement, formalizing the observer with UPC operators. Phil Papers. https://philpapers.org/rec/escasra Escogido Gutierrez, E. 2026a. Formalizing phenomenology, the universal principle of collapse as a structural foundation for meaning, recognition, and the observer. Phil Papers. https://philpapers.org/rec/escogido Gutierrez, E. 2026b. From musical experience to quantum structure. E. Formalizing the universal principle of collapse across domains. Phil Papers. https://philpapers.org/rec/escogido Gutierrez, E. 2026c. Objectivity as high consensus collapse, a structural expansion of the universal principle of collapse, UPC. Phil Papers. https://philpapers.org/rec/escoa Gutierrez, E. 2026d. The UPC, Quantum Bridge, a clear structural resolution of the measurement problem. Phil Papers. https://philpapers.org/rec/escogido Gutierrez, E. 2026e. The Universal Principle of Collapse, UPC extending collapse from quantum measurement to human meaning. Phil Papers. https://philpapers.org/rec/escchup5 Zenodo. 2026, UPC papers mirrored on Zenodo Data Repository. https://zenodo.org/record/193105336 Escogido Gutierrez, E. 2026. Author S. General Writings Substack. https://eloiscagedogutierrez.substack.com